scene transitions with a single image in Unity. All right, we're going to fade in and out of a scene using an image in this part. In the next part, we'll look at using a video. So to do that, we're going to be using Shadergraph, and Shadergraph needs to be installed through Package Manager. And when you install Shadergraph, you need to be using either the Universal Render Pipeline or the High Definition Render Pipeline. Okay, so let's take a look at some of the image stuff. So I have a couple of scripts in here. I have, let's see here. I have a canvas with it set to screen space camera. I have the main camera dragged into there with a plane distance of 0.2. The camera, the minimum, the near clipping plane is 0.01, so this is just in front of that. Make sure that your near clipping plane, is small enough that you can still see the canvas. Otherwise, you're not going to see the fade in and fade out. So I have a few more settings on here. And then I have this image scene transition. And then inside of here, I have like the actual object that's fading in and fading out. On it, I have a raw image with a custom material with a shader on it that I made in Shadergraph. And if I just drag this, you can kind of see what we're going to be achieving. So we have an image here that has a threshold slider, and you can even change the color of it if you want. So let's just take a look at the Shadergraph, just so you can see what nodes are in there and how it's kind of working. So we have our unlit Shadergraph with the color just dragged straight into color. And then for the alpha, we have this fun gradient texture. And that's just going from 1, which is white, to black, which is 0. And we're subtracting 1 from that. So that means it's remapping it from 1 to 0 to 0 to -1. So everything shows up black. And then what we're doing is we're using that slider to add to that texture. So now we're starting to add some like gray values back in there. And then we're using the ceiling node. And what that does is if something isn't equal to, if something's greater than 0, it's going to force it to be 1. So what that does is it gives us this really sharp white and black image. And so we're plugging that into the alpha. And so that's how we're able to use a single image and adjust the threshold on it to get, sure, I'll save it, to get this sort of effect. One other thing to note is this is kind of a special image. It is actually a 16-bit image. So when you go into the settings for the image, make sure you have at least 16-bit enabled. There is a bug with WebGL right now, and so that's why I have it set to 24-bit. For some reason, 16-bit textures aren't supported. So let's take a look at the code that's going into adjusting this material. So there's really only 2 scripts to look at. Let's look at this one, image scene transition. So we have our material, and we have a property value of 0. Is that even being used? Yes. Okay. And at the start of the game, it's going to fade in the texture. So it's gonna animate. So let's see here, fade in. I'm setting is fade out to false. We'll get to that in a minute. Update material. We're setting the threshold to a value of 1, and we are animating the threshold value using this function. So this is actually using itween, and itween's kind of weird. It has a really weird syntax to it. Uses a thing called hash tables. There's documentation here if you want to take a look at it. It's not the greatest animation tool, and there's definitely other ways to do it. It's just really easy to get it to do the things that you want it to do. So what we have is we have this function called animate property that we're passing in how long we want it to take and what value we want to animate to. So what this function is doing is itween value 2, and it's going to take the current value of the material, the current threshold, and animate to whatever value we told it to do it. And it's going to do it for the amount of time that we told it to animate for. So in this case, 1 second. And we're giving it a 1 second delay. You don't need to have that. You could get rid of it. I just kind of like how it feels. The update target is this game object. And on update, it's going to update every frame, update material. So that's this function. And it's going to animate this value using a linear easing curve. So that's just a straight line. So it's not going to like slowly ramp in or ramp out of the value. It's just going to go straight to it. And then when it's finished animating, it's going to call on complete or fade out complete. And again, it's this target. So this update material just updates the threshold value on the material. So it's doing that every frame until this is done. And then when this is done, it calls this function fade out complete. And what it's checking for is, was it fading out of the level? And if it did fade out, then load the next level. So if it was a fade in this case, see, fade in, we're just setting that to false. So that's just a way that we can reuse the same function both times and only have it affect the fade out. So that's kind of a lot. But it's really cool because you can just use a single image to animate this. So you could swap out this image for, squares. You could swap it out for all sorts of really cool things. You could do like crazy gradients. Making Stuff Look Good in video games did a video on this sort of thing with like the Pokemon transition. And this is basically the same sort of material. It's just doing it in Shadergraph instead of writing it from scratch. So in that video, you should check it out. He did like really crazy Pokemon transitions. So you could do that. But you might notice this isn't really the puzzle piece effect that we were going for. And I want to just want to talk about that here for a minute. I tested this out and I thought everything was great until I loaded in the puzzle piece animation. And let me just show you how I made that real quick. So in After Effects, I made a puzzle piece animation like this. And I exported that out as frames. So here are all the frames. And then I used a piece of software called Image Magic. And I just ran this line of code. And what that did was it just grabbed all of the frames, added them together, and then averaged them. And so that's how I created that cool, like this thing right here. And so then when I did it with the puzzle piece, I didn't think about it, but there's actually overlapping parts to the puzzle piece. And that totally breaks how this image transition works. I spent so long trying to figure out another way to make this work. I was trying to look at like distance fields and like normal maps, and like, can I displace things with different channels? Can I encode some of the data in one channel and then the other data in another channel, and hopefully that the frames are far enough away that there's no overlap? And I couldn't get it. I couldn't get the effect that I wanted. Not to say that this is a bad transition effect. This is really cool and it works really well. It just wasn't the effect that I was going for. So if you can come up with a way to encode that overlapping sort of animation, like this sort of thing, in a single image, I really want to see it, because I spent hours trying to get this to work. I just couldn't come up with a way. So that's going to lead me to the second part of this, the video approach of how to do scene transitions. So I will see you guys in the next video where we look at that.